Hey everyone, it's Father Ryan, and in this video I just want to look at the so-called lost Gospels or apocryphal Gospels that claim to be transmitting ancient secrets about Jesus that were not approved by the early church, kind of hid these ancient secrets about Jesus. Maybe you've seen some cable television programs around Christmas or Easter about the discoveries of the lost Gospels and whether the church has been hiding these things for centuries. And in fact, what we'll see is that early church fathers, they didn't just talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They also actually knew about these other lost gospels that were just, recently found in the past century. And in fact, it's not news. I mean, the church has known about these since the beginning, and church fathers talked about them. And so 4 of the earliest so-called lost gospels or apocryphal gospels from the 2nd century are the infancy gospel of Thomas, the gospel of Peter, the gospel of Judas, and the gospel of Thomas. So the infancy Gospel of Thomas claims to be written by the Apostle Thomas and recording details about Jesus' childhood. And there are stories about Jesus killing other children because they aggravated him. It's kind of interesting. Jesus, the child murderer. Another is the Gospel of Thomas. It's a collection of 114 sayings attributed to the Apostle Thomas that Jesus said in secret to him. And the most famous saying in this Gospel of Thomas is what Jesus said about women. He says, quote, "Look, I shall guide her to make her male, so she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter heaven's kingdom." And so apparently the Gospel of Thomas says every female must become a male in order to enter heaven. Also, the Gospel of Judas is the most recently discovered, in modern times of all the lost Gospels in 1978. It also claims to be a secret conversation between Judas and Jesus. And it tells of immortal eons with strange names, kind of just like, it's clearly written by Gnostics of the 2nd century, which was kind of a Christian amalgamation of Gnostic teachings of secret knowledge. You had to kind of be on the inside knowledge of this core group in order to be saved. And finally, the Gospel of Peter, it's a fragmentary account of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, but it really claims that Jesus' divinity kind of left him on the cross, and Jesus was kind of swept up to heaven before he died, and he didn't really die. And so these tell very different stories about, Jesus that we know from the 4 authentic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But at face value, these Gospels claim to be written by apostles, claim to have equal authority to the 4 Gospels. But the fact is, these so-called lost Gospels were always rejected and immediately rejected by the early church fathers and early Christians as forgeries and fakes. They've known about them, we've known about them since the 2nd century. They spoke about the origins of these lost Gospels that have recently been rediscovered. And in every case, they reject them. So in the 2nd century, St. Irenaeus, who remember was a disciple of St. Polycarp, who knew the Apostle John, so very close to the apostles. He knew about the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and he says emphatically that the stories contained in there about the childhood of Jesus are a spurious forgery, he says. And he also knew about the Gospel of Judas, the kind of these secret conversations between Jesus and Judas, and he calls it a fictitious history attributed to Judas, but actually written by the 2nd century Gnostic heretics. And so these were not early eyewitness accounts of Jesus. They were very later kind of amalgamations of Christian heresies. Also, the Gospel of Peter was known by a 2nd century bishop named Serapius in Syria. And he says at once that the Gospel of Peter, as soon as he read it, he knew that it was not an authentic account. He says, quote, "We rightly receive both Peter and the other apostles as Christ, but we reject intelligently the writings falsely ascribed to them, knowing that such were not handed down to us." Right? They differ a lot from the actual authentic Gospels, and they knew the difference. Early Christians knew the difference between authentic Gospels and fakes and forgeries, and they didn't approve of the latter. And finally, the Gospel of Thomas was known by early Christians. St. Eusebius of Caesarea, early church historian, and St. Cyril of Jerusalem say, "To none of these Gospels has anyone who belonged to the teachers of the church ever thought it right to refer in his writings. The opinion of their contents is widely dissonant from true orthodoxy and clearly shows they are forgeries of heretics." And so the evidence is unanimous in the early church. Every time they talk about these so-called lost Gospels, apocryphal Gospels, they reject them as fakes, and they accept and believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by apostles.